Welcome to What Lies Beyond with your host, Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. This podcast accompanies the What Lies Beyond book by Matt Coburn, now available for purchase on Amazon and other retail outlets. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com. Today my guest is Jessica Bockler, PhD. Jessica is an applied artist, transpersonal psychologist, and co-founding director of the Alef Trust. She serves as Deputy CEO and works across Alef Trust's academic and applied portfolios. Trained in applied and physical theatre, Jessica has extensive experience of expressive arts facilitation, as well as experimental movement and voice work. She specialises in embodied alternatives to accessing creativity and imagination, and she is the founder of Creative Alternatives, an arts-based mental well-being service in the UK, which provides creative interventions to adults experiencing depression, stress, and/or anxiety. The service is one of the longest established social prescribing projects in the UK and has won several awards for innovation in public service delivery. We begin with a look at how creativity, imagination, and play can enhance your mental health. We explore the connections between embodiment, transpersonal psychology, and mystical experience. Jessica describes some of her work with the Conscious Community Initiative, which explores the intersections between inner transpersonal practice and social change. We discuss the inner development goals of the UN, and we finish with an important dialogue on how to acknowledge and respond constructively to the current moment of political, cultural, and ecological turmoil. Jessica Bockler. So we've actually known each other for a few years now, but before I had to research your work for this interview, I didn't fully realise that you actually started off in acting. So could you tell me a little bit about that and how that led to transpersonal psychology?
Yes, thank you, Matt, and thank you for having me on the podcast. It's quite a journey, and it began in 1996 when I came over from Germany to join the Liverpool Institute for Performing Arts to train in acting and directing, with a focus on community arts, actually. So I've always had an interest in how creativity can be applied for the greater good, right, in the broadest possible terms. But those initial 3 years really set me off on a journey, not primarily exploring the performing arts industry. I did some shows in theaters, I did some experimental film work. But what really happened was that I became very intrigued in the power of creativity to make a difference in people's lives. And as I was working as a community artist, as a theatre director and actor in many different kinds of community settings, I really found that by being creative, by being engaged physically and through dance movement work, through improvisation, blending art forms as well, creative writing, playing, people were turning their lives around, were empowered to tell their stories, but also to make different choices for themselves. So by that I mean I was drawn quite extensively into the arts and health sector. Here in the UK, I worked in community projects which were about improving mental health, things like stress and depression and anxiety, and really, yeah, giving people a play space, a space where they could creatively express themselves. And there I was seeing it over and over, how through creativity, play, trying something different and being in a supportive space where everybody was doing that. And so it wasn't strange. It was welcome and encouraged. People began to kind of come alive and overcome, some significant life challenges that they were faced with. And it doesn't mean that creativity is a quick fix, but it really did show me how being creative can make a huge difference to people wherever they are in their lives. And that intrigued me. And I wanted to find out more about what happens when we are creative, psychosomatically speaking. Alongside that, I always had an interest in consciousness, in spirituality. And, I grew up with a father who had an interest in Rupert Sheldrake and was reading Sheldrake's work to me when I was a kid, right? I remember going to bed and having reading Rupert Sheldrake's work with my dad reading bedtime stories to me, you know. And that sort of resonated all through my early career as an artist. And this is what brought me to the field of consciousness studies and transpersonal psychology over a number of years. At the time, when I was looking for a course, a master's program to explore what is consciousness, I didn't know the term transpersonal psychology. And when I then researched it, found all these amazing courses over in the United States, at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology and California Institute for Integral Studies, amazing courses, but a long way away. I was living in the northwest of England at the time. And then there was this one course that was just on the doorstep, as it were, at Liverpool John Moores University. Well, and the rest is history. I joined that course and then, of course, entered into a PhD later on, combining theatre studies and transpersonal psychology. That, if you want to go there and explore that, that was an amazing exploration over a number of years. Really deep diving into theatre as a vehicle for change, for more transpersonal work. And that is how I entered into the field of transpersonal studies and transpersonal psychology. Yeah.
Wow. There's so much to pick up on there. I think the first thing that leaps out is, well, we live in a culture, I think, that likes to put things in boxes. So you've got the mental health box, you've got the personal development box, then you've got the creative art box, and I'd say perhaps even the play box. These are all often separated and seen as very different things. So, for example, personal development perhaps is seen as something serious, something that you have to work at and perhaps a bit grim. Well, hopefully not, but do you understand what I'm saying? It's
Yes,
sort of
right.
in the serious category of the bookshop. And then play is often, perhaps it's not quite as bad now, but it can be dismissed as trivial, something you do when you've stopped working. And it sounds to me like you would really trying to integrate some of these fields through what you saw. So the second thing is that you were really talking about the link between creativity and mental health. And one thing that I saw about depression quite a while ago was, I think it was Burton, his Anatomy of Melancholy, a sort of huge sort of 16th century tome on, or 17th century tome on depression. He said depression is a disease of the imagination. And I remember when I read that, I thought, well, maybe then retraining or refreeing the imagination might help with depression. So what was that? What were you tell me a little bit more about what you were seeing in terms of sort of recovery and sort of health when people engaged with things like acting and painting and writing.
Yeah. There's so many stories, and it was really moving work as well, Matt. The kinds of work that we did in the programs that I was involved in, and in fact, we still have a program that's running now, Creative Alternatives, which is funded through public health and delivered in a particular local authority here in the UK. And that work is very much about kind of creating a safe space where people can come together with artists, not be labeled as having a mental health problem, but rather coming there as people and as people who are creative. So kind of reframing, that's the first thing, offering an opportunity for a space which doesn't put, any labels on people. And people are working with artists rather than mental health professionals. And then really seeing, okay, what do you want to try out? What would you like to play with? What materials? So putting options, in front of people and saying, want to place it with some wood, or, are you into more visual arts, or would you like to try creative writing? Or for those who are, more inclined theatrically, would you like to do something where we are, we're playing together, we're improvising? And what I have seen over and over, when people get over this initial moment of, oh, okay, it's a bit strange. We're doing something that's a little bit quirky because we're not, painting by numbers or producing a particular outcome or product for a gallery or anything like that. You can scribble, you can mess things up, you can rip them up, you can start again, you can mess with the materials. We encourage this sort of more messy play. Then something opens up in people and they feel there's a kind of sense of, oh my God, I can do something. Like, for example, we also, in this one local authority we worked in, we went out into nature quite a lot. There were beautiful beaches. So we went out and we went for picnics. And people started playing on the beach, building sandcastles and, sun sculptures with, working with tools that you normally only see children use. So it was this complete giving permission of, try this. Why not? Who cares? Who says that only children can do this? So giving permission and people then following through and trusting their own creative play impulse. And that was kind of then trickling through into their daily lives in terms of, oh, wow, maybe I'll try something else. Maybe I'll go and, volunteer at an art gallery and try something new in my life. Actually, I never have been to an art gallery before, but why not? I'm going to go there. We also did outings and we brought people into those spaces that they thought weren't for them. That was another thing. So again, giving permission and normalizing that, you're part of all of these cultural institutions are your birthright. You can go there. You belong there. And people started getting into new jobs, making different lifestyle choices for themselves, slowly, 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 right? Bit by bit, step by step. And we encourage that by keeping in touch, by building a creative community, by offering these outings and gatherings and get-togethers, and just really, perpetually encouraging people to consider that they could make different choices in their lives. That's it in a sort of broad overview. And then there are just lots of beautiful stories of how people made these different choices, including, I remember there was a man who had been a soldier who was suffering from post-traumatic stress, from some of the things that he had experienced during war. And he sat with us in a room, and for quite some time, actually, he didn't want to engage with some of the creative activities we were doing. We were at one point putting the arts materials down. We were painting with hands, directly with the hands onto canvas. And he sat there and he then left the room, and I followed him out into the corridor, and he turned to me and he said, Jessica, I can't do that. I can't create anything with my hands. And he was really quite shaking and really anxious. And I just stayed with him. And then he disclosed to me that he had killed. He had killed in theaters of war as a soldier. And he felt that his hands couldn't create anything new because he had taken lives. And that was such a big moment for him. I stayed with him. He then chose to come back into the room, and gradually in the space, he stayed with it, and he began to pick up pen, pencil, some other tools to do a little bit, drinking, having cups of tea, sitting with people. And over time, he reclaimed his creative power. And it was such a profound healing journey to witness that. He then also made different choices in his life as to where he was living. He was in a place where, he was into gardening, and he also had kittens at home, and he brought pictures in and shared them. And where he was living, his garden was, he couldn't keep it up in the best possible way. There were problems with young people and gangs who would come in and cause problems. So he chose to move somewhere else. And he turned his life around through the choices he made. This is just one example of a story of someone who had been in a really difficult space. And then over time, as he journeyed with us, he kind of found a spark of life again. And yes, he had lived through something incredibly traumatic. And, who we didn't judge him. We tried to hold the space for him. And he came back to life. And that was just so beautiful to witness.
It speaks on so many levels. So when people experience trauma like that, you quite often get the impression that they get cut off from many of their naturally existing capacities. So their capacity for, well, flexible change, but also for creativity, for imagination. And they also get cut off from those sources of inner joy as well. So it sounds to me like the creative process helps to perhaps reconnect people with those inner capacities.
I would certainly agree with that. That it's play, maybe more than creativity. It's the invitation to kind of liberate this inner impulse and to give ourselves permission to do things differently. And I would say it's very beneficial in trauma, and I mean, in trauma therapy, using these sort of bottom up approaches where we are engaged physically and in sensory activity. Again, you have to, take a person-centered approach here, but generally speaking, working in these physically engaging ways can be incredibly healing and open up, the potential, open up the aperture of awareness and of possibility for people. And I think that goes for everybody. Because we can get caught up in these sort of behavioral loops, right? Where we do things in a particular way and we narrow down our options and we don't see anymore what other choices we could make in our lives. And that gets reinforced by the people around us who expect us to behave in certain ways, and also by the sort of environmental cues. Everything sort of keeps us within certain bounds of kind of behavior. So creating these play spaces just open up possibilities for people to make different choices. And the critical thing is also that you have a supportive community that then helps you to maintain new choices that you're making, because it does take time and it does take some effort to choose something different. Yeah.
So, I mean, the other element that you're touching on here is embodiment, because I think this is something you've got a word for it, which we sort of just, was it cognoscentrism?
Mhm.
So again, this is a cultural bias here. We're very biased towards sort of that rational, analytical, and actually quite disembodied mode of being and consciousness. And uh, one of my day jobs anyway is helping people get into exercise programs if they have medical conditions or they've been sedentary for a long time. And one of the reasons why I got into that was exactly because I was doing exercise. Not just, there are lots of reasons to do exercise, but well-being was an absolute central part of that. And it sounds to me like sort of things like acting and dance are other ways of accessing that sort of perhaps physicality you might have lost touch with.
For sure. Absolutely, yes. Um, cognicentrism is a big problem in our world, and in the kind of Western industrialized countries that are foregrounding an education that addresses this part of us, the head. Um, I think many of us have gone through those schooling systems, right, that are just pushing us in terms of our academic skills and are leaving out huge aspects of being that are really, our birthright, our kind of other intelligences, more somatic intelligence or intelligence of the heart to do with, the emotional intelligence, relational intelligence. And then also, creativity, creative intelligence, musical intelligence. If you're lucky, you get to go to a school where, maybe there are some extracurricular activities that are covering those things, or maybe even, a little bit of dance and drama within the curriculum. But yeah, the STEM subjects are overemphasized, and the way we are taught to learn and taught to engage is purely through the sort of verbal domain and through, rational thinking. And that's such a big mistake because it leaves out huge possibilities for other ways of knowing and for caring for others, not just humans, but also other beings that we share this planet with, and other ways of knowing that give us great ability to connect with Earth, with other
Yes.
species. Yeah.
Yes, and I'd include for sure spiritual, mystical modes of consciousness that are again very marginalized in our culture. But one of the prime features of those is to help reconnect us with, well, go beyond the self. That's what transpersonal means, isn't it? So, was this part of the sort of rationale for founding the Alef Trust?
Mm, yes, very much. To create a home for a kind of education that would foreground more post-materialist, to use a technical term, modes of consciousness or models of consciousness, to create a home for education that would be more integrative, so also give permission to weave in experiential knowing and practice and application into the learning journey, and to create a kind of home and community for people who are feeling alone in that, who were kind of sensing, oh, there are other ways of being and doing, but where can I do this? So for me, that's a big part of all of it, to model something new in terms of how we can engage in academic learning and discourse and research, but also to create that sense of community, to bring people together and to say you're not alone in this, because we need one another. How many of us are there around the world who are kind of championing more spiritual or more transpersonal perspectives? There are more and more of us, but not a huge amount of people. And so you can feel quite isolated, right? Wherever you are when you're doing this work. And so it feels like really important to come together in community and also lift each other up and help each other to become more visible in this work and give credibility to this way of working that says, it's good to honor other ways of knowing, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so important because you're quite right with people who are specifically focused on things like transpersonal psychology might be something of a minority. But at the same time, I think there is a great, perhaps, thirst for finding new ways precisely because we are living in such a dysfunctional era where I think there is a consciousness that a lot of the ways that have perhaps become entrenched sort of worldviews, but also institutional practices. They seem to be contributing to the problems rather than the solutions. So I think there is a great thirst for finding healthier alternatives. This has certainly really been coming home to me very much. It's like we're talking about trauma. So I was listening to Gabor Mate's a lot of his talks and also his wonderful book, A Myth of Normal, where he lays out how widespread trauma is in our culture. So that's the downside. But the upside is that there exist these modalities of healing that can complement sort of perhaps more conventional medicines. So, and not just medicine as well. I think again we've got these boxes, haven't we? So,
Yeah.
so it's actually broader than that.
Yeah. It's true. And we're living in incredible times in a way. And there are all these issues that are coming to the surface. But then there are also all these beautiful communities. And, we're interweaving more and more and networking amongst each other. Beautiful communities who are trying to address all these issues, like the Pocket Project, for example, doing work in trauma healing and global trauma witnessing, bringing people together in order to hold trauma and tend to trauma in more caring, holistic ways. And it's wonderful to see all these, somebody called them islands of sanity. I don't know where that term came from. Was it Charles Eisenstein? It may have been his writings. But this sense of we're creating these islands or these communities where we are trying to tend to what is going on in the world in more wholesome ways. That's really, to me, I mean, that gives me a sense of empowerment and a sense of a hope. Despite all the craziness that we're going through, that there are lots of people already really working on different ways of doing and being. Somebody called it a second renaissance. That I think I've come across a paper recently which was mapping different approaches towards the second renaissance that we're going through. And that is what I hope is happening, that we are indeed shifting gradually towards better ways of being and doing. Yeah, but in the meantime, we go through what Ken Wilber called it aperspectival madness, I think, in one of his books. Aperspectival madness, that sense of everything's just melting down, everything's becoming meaningless because, we're in this postmodern mishmash of, well, all values are equal, so no values are of any value anymore.
Yes.
And we need to get beyond that. We really do. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is a very encouraging conversation, I think, because particularly at the moment, without going into too much into detail politically, but not just politically, actually, in terms of communities, in terms of cultures, certainly in terms of ecological breakdown, I think it's very easy to lose heart. But what have actually been seeing is exactly what you said, that there is a sense that we can't leave it to other people anymore. We've got to start getting together in community and really rethink things on a grassroots level. And I think, we can debate whether hope's appropriate or not. That's another debate. But I think if we want to raise our morale, then building those new communities and trying to reimagine things is probably going to be the way forward. So with that in mind, I think you're alluding to the Conscious Community Initiative, which is run under the Alef Trust, and you're one of the people who directs that. So could you tell us a little bit about the Conscious Community Initiative? Because I was looking through the report, I think Nurturing the Fields of Change, some really fascinating projects you've been facilitating.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I'm 100% with you and everything you've just said. And that need to inculcate, to come together in community in order, again, it's interesting because I mentioned creative alternatives earlier on and the work we were doing in arts and health. In a way, this is very similar. It's the coming together in community in a space that feels reasonably safe and brave. Those are a couple of terms that are being used, aren't they, to kind of describe these kind of communities of practice that we need in order to inculcate the new. So they are really about bringing people together who are already working on projects around the world to bring about some form of transformation, to address something that really needs tending. And I can give you some examples. So, for example, there are a number of projects that we've also been able to fund to support what they're doing, and to research the efficacy of the work to see how is that work generating benefit for the people who are attending and for the people who are then benefiting through kind of ripple effect. So, for example, there is a creative media artist who is based in India, and she worked with an education center, a nature education center, which also had a kind of spiritual orientation. And she was making films with young people who came after school time and spent time at the center to explore issues around plastic pollution in the area. And they made films together to address this issue around pollution, and then shared that with other young people in the local schools. So this was very much about empowering the young people to have a conversation about the pollution that they were witnessing in the local area and what they could do about that. And that was rippling through into the school system there, involving the teachers, the parents, and the kinds of choices that they were making as a community there in order to tackle the issue of pollution. That was one project in India. Um, there's another project which had actually locations in India and Ireland, and it was working with young people, again, drawing on integrative education methods to empower those young people. And they were all experiencing forms of poverty, either abject poverty, literally, not having a lot to eat or very limited access to foods in India. And then in Ireland, it was young people who were going through extreme emotional poverty, relational poverty. Some of them were children that had been displaced as a result of the war in Ukraine. And there, the facilitators were working in community centers to bring these young people together, to give them a space where they could express themselves, explore together, grow food together as well. So engaging them in activities that were very earthy, again, playful, inviting in their exploration of themselves, and kind of bringing them together to give them a space where they could meet each other in a different way. So it's this kind of a work that's happening in the Conscious Community Initiative. Those are two examples, but there are many more. We had a doctor, for example, from South Africa who engaged his colleagues in the medical sector in an integrative education program, looking at how can we make medicine more holistic, more integrative. And that was fascinating as well. And these were clinicians, who were working kind of in mainstream settings, but also engaging in some quite complex societal issues in South Africa. So again, so fascinating, all these different projects that are happening. And we bring people together who are doing this work in order to then resource them, to support them, and help them feel like they're not doing this alone, and they can share best practice. They can be inspired by others who are doing similar work. It's really encouraging, isn't it, when others are sort of accompanying you in that work and are seeing it, and you feel like you're not alone, but there are others like you who are doing this elsewhere. So that is what the Conscious Community Initiative is about. It's about research, it's about accompaniment, it's about storytelling and sharing the benefits of this work. We need to do more of that. We're focusing more on that this year, building out the storytelling and sharing more of these examples, because there are lots and lots, and often they're not visible enough. There's so much beautiful work that's happening in the world, and it's not so visible. So that's another piece for us in all of this, to showcase this work and spread the word about it. Yeah.
And again, I think that's something that often gets lost in the news headlines or on sort of social media feeds, where it's, if you're not careful, you can get fed a constantly negative diet of things that might be important, but I think that it can be very disempowering. So again, I think it's so important. Again, there's number of things that we can pick up here, but I think it's so important to help raise people's morale, to network, to show them that other people are doing similar sort of work, and that it can really have a cumulative effect. I mean, one of the projects that looked interesting to me was teaching yoga to labor activists in Mexico. And I thought that actually segued into one concept which I find very interesting, which is what you call subtle activism. So could you tell me what subtle activism is?
Yes, it's a term that's associated with the work of David Nichol. He has been in the field of consciousness studies for many, many years. And he has also been, he and also other people around him, quite a few people in the integral and transpersonal community who have an interest in doing work in the world, in, challenging in some way or other the status quo. So subtle activism is a form of activism which isn't polarizing, isn't sort of standing up to the status quo and saying, you're wrong. It's not about climbing a bridge, stopping the traffic on the M25, those kinds of forms of activism which are out there and which are, you can see it in my body language. They're sort of jarring. They're kind of trying to wake people up by protesting and by kind of creating polarization, which in some ways I think just fuel the fires of everything that's going on. So subtle activism is about leaning into other states, more expanded states of consciousness. Say we might be in a meditation together, we might come together as a group, sit together, meditate, open the aperture of awareness, and hold the well-being of all beings on earth in mind and heart. And through practices like meditation and prayer and other forms of more contemplative engagement, to help bring about a shift in the sort of energetic frequency of this planet, lifting us up to different states of being that are more conducive, more wholesome, more peaceful. There's a whole body of research has been undertaken in that field by the Global Consciousness Project, and also the work associated with oh gosh, now it's not coming to me. Maharishi, that's not coming to me right now. But the work that was all about transcendental forms of meditation and practitioners coming together. Ramana Maharshi, I think. Yeah, sorry.
I think it was Maharishi.
Maharishi, that's the word. I was just thinking the name isn't clicking, not right. But yes, Maharishi, thank you. Coming together and sitting in prayer or in meditation in order to make a shift in a wider societal sphere. I was going to go somewhere else with this. So subtle activism, it's also more. It's leaning into a form of social engagement, social change engagement that is more about fostering love and care and a kind of peace between us, so that we're not polarizing. We're more able to accept opinions that don't resonate with our own. So we're more able to, yes, inhabit our position, but then also be receptive to the perspectives of the other. And that, I think, is a crucial part of more subtle forms of activism. Yeah. Yeah.
So again, there's such a lot to unpack there, including ideas about the shadow and projection, that when polarization happens, we tend to project all of those worse attributes, perhaps, that we might be a bit ashamed of in ourselves upon this sort of faceless other. This subtle activism concept reminds me very much of, there's an activist called Anthea Lawson who a few years ago wrote a book called The Entangled Activist. And there's somewhat of a resonance there, because what happened was, I think she was working for Amnesty International. So they learned firsthand how destructive some of the sort of the monetary systems and things that we rely on can be. And I think she at that time she realized that she was actually quite unhappy, because she was angry all the time, and she had to back off, and she eventually, I think, resigned from the organization. But she wrote this book called The Entangled Activist, which is basically the idea that activists are entangled with their opponents. They're entangled in the systems that they're trying to change. So essentially we need to look after our own and cultivate our own well-being and personal transformation, rather than just sidelining it and burning out, which is what's happening a lot. And there's another author, Stephen Wright. I was just reading his book Burnout over Christmas, which had it was about burnout not just amongst activists, but in NHS workers, for example. And he was saying that quite often it's seen as too much stress, but actually a lot of the time it's about a spiritual crisis. So again, we have this approach, and we realize that sort of transpersonal approaches and spiritual approaches aren't just dispensable or sort of weekend things. They're actually central to the ways that we might be moving forwards.
Yeah, I love the way you articulated that. It's the realization that this entanglement, the state we foster on the inside plays a critical role in what is possible on the outside, right? Because inside and outside are arbitrary divisions anyway. So it's exactly that, this inner work that needs to happen, and inner individual as well as inner collective. It's the recognition that we are entangled and that what we inculcate within us and between us has a very tangible effect in the world. It's this kind of magical quality, isn't it, of human beings are very generative beings. We bring things into being, and we're incredibly able to manipulate and shape shift matter. And our sort of internal world plays a part in that creative process, this generative process. So what we believe, what we hold, the values we hold dear, and the kinds of energy we put into what we're doing has an effect. Whether it's annoying someone, right, falling out with each other, whether it's a kind of burnout effect, kind of we're driving ourselves too hard because we're sort of still living with an industrialized mindset whilst trying to do good in the world. That's a really interesting dynamic, right? To really see at what am I still living of, the system that I'm actually against or want to shift and change. How am I still inhabiting and embodying that, right? Where am I going fast? Where am I oriented towards outputs that I want to see in the world? Where am I driving myself according to certain standards? All of that kind of comes from this sort of industrialized mindset, whilst maybe wanting to shift towards something that is slower, that gives permission for, being with process, being on a journey, rather than having this progress orientation, which is everywhere as well. I mean, we have to make progress. What does that actually mean? Why are we driving ourselves in these ways? So, understanding the inner dimension of this work feels absolutely critical. Yeah. Thank you
Yes.
for that.
I mean, and I think it really highlights another sort of cultural deficit, if you like, that can be illustrated by a from a book which was reporting a meeting between the Dalai Lama and scientists, and he used to do that regularly. The book's called Destructive Emotions by Daniel Goleman, and in one of the discussions of how do you define a destructive emotion, the sort of the scientists, who are mostly from the global north, a lot were from America, not all, but they were going, well, it's an emotion that causes harm to other people. And then the Dalai Lama says, well, for us, the harm is done within first.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a fascinating contrast between the sort of ideas that might be predominant still in the global north, that you have to wait until you see the destructiveness before actually dealing with it at its root.
Yeah, that's so
So,
true.
um, but also, I mean, obviously, I think I'm oversimplifying slightly, because we all understand, I think, that negative emotions can be very destructive just to people's quality of life. So dealing with it, but also acknowledging them, so we can work in the world better. And working with them is quite a complicated thing. It's like at the moment, I was reading Pema Chodron's book, Places That Scare Us. And it's all about not rejecting those negative emotions, but allowing space for them as a method of transformation. And I must admit, Jessica, that I'm still learning on that one. It's still quite tough to sit down with. If you're feeling frightened, it's quite tough to sit down, but actually it can potentially be very fruitful as well.
Yes, completely hear you. And, feeling into that, the kinds of things we've done in nurturing the fields of change. On the one hand, they are about feeling into what are the new possibilities, what, can we do now, kind of looking ahead, as it were, or kind of sensing into the present moment and then seeing what is arising there between us. But tending to that present moment also really means to sit with the grief and honor the fear and the heartbrokenness that we can feel, we can't not do that. Because then we're just creating we're repressing something that's very real for many of us. I remember sitting in some of the sessions with the community and feeling that. There was a meditation I led at one point, and I had this image up on screen of a leaf and a little drop of water hanging off that leaf. And it was a photo that I'd taken during a walk, just a few days prior. And it sort of encapsulated how I was feeling at that time. This was maybe like a year and a half ago. My father had just died, and other things that were going on in my life were quite difficult. And I was witnessing what was happening around the world, including the war in Ukraine and the craziness in Israel and Gaza, all of that. And it really did make me feel. I remember being on the walk and then later sitting in the session sharing this picture. And I felt as small as that little drop of water. I felt this sense of, what on earth are we going to do? What can I do? I'm just this little drop hanging there, about to fall off, into the abyss. It felt like that sense of despair, frankly.
Yeah.
We have to be with each other in that. We can't bypass that or sidestep it. It needs to be spoken of and it needs to be held. It needs a container. And only if we do that can we then also see what is possible. We have to go through the dying process that is happening. There is a lot that's dying right now. And I am very aware as I'm saying that I'm sitting, in a comfortable house in a country that's still reasonably stable. And there are lots of people around the world who are in absolutely horrible circumstances, who've already lost their homes, due to a fire or a flood or whatever else is going on. So that gives me a sense of, wow, I need to do, because I'm still in this place where I can do something wider. I'm going to do everything I can to show up and support people and hope to, make a difference in one way or other. But yeah, wow, that so speaks to me. I feel we need to honor all of that heartbrokenness and the grief that we're all
Absolutely. I mean, with climate breakdown, for example, the news just comes in every day, every week, every month. Things seem to get worse. I subscribe to Carbon Brief, and if I wanted to, I could immerse myself in the horrible details on a daily basis. And I think up to a point, it is important to have perhaps a realistic orientation. So we're not just selling what's been called hopium, sort of false hope.
Yeah.
I think that's very important. We need to honor loss, and we need to see and be realistic that there are likely quite a few more losses yet to come. But for me, that's not the end of the process. And I was very encouraged by writers like Joanna Macy, who does Active Hope. And she starts with that grief. That's the beginning of the process that we open up. And she was saying that in a way, or in a lot of ways, it's actually good that we're feeling these things in response to the wildfires or the floods or whatever, because it means we're still alive. We're still connected with the rest of the earth. We're still connected with communities. We still care. And that's so much better than just sort of numbing it off, isn't it?
Yeah, completely and utterly. I love Joanna Macy's work and also Terry Patton's work in A New Republic of the Heart. Now, Terry passed away a few years ago, but that work is still going. And fairly recently, I was actually sitting in one of their sessions, which was about transcending wokeism, which was a really fascinating conversation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Really looking at, transcend and include. How can we honor the principles of social justice and caring for each other and caring for people who've been marginalized and who've been, hurt very badly, whilst not losing ourselves in, political correctness and canceling culture and all these sort of, so-called microaggressions, and where nobody doesn't, can't say anything anymore because it's like, oh my God, what word can I use? It's a really good example for where something that had a good intention has now become something, the word feels so toxic, you can't touch it, right? And it's been used by the so-called by the right. I don't even agree anymore that there is a left and a right. I think we need to transcend all those, camps. But yes,
I agree.
it's
I
like
agree. I think
the,
increasing numbers of people feel a deep dissatisfaction with the existing polarizations. And it's one thing that I've been finding looking through social media,
yeah,
with one faction shouting at another. This is not an argument for equivalence, by the way. There are undoubtedly more destructive and unhealthier groups in the world than others. But at the same time, there's again this feeling of the need to go back to grassroots and rethink basic principles, rethink what our values are, and then rebuild something new from those basic principles. And I mean, for me, a lot of it really is about sort of restoration. A lot of it's about restoring community and ecology and well-being, and thinking, what is a good life? What kind of life can we live? What's practically possible? But also, what do we want?
yeah,
And I
yeah.
think that's so much more constructive than shouting at one another. I really do.
Absolutely, yes, yes. And this, you keep coming back to having community, right? Local community. A lot of what the Trust does is, online, and it's global communities of interest in effect. But yes, that's valuable. It's beautiful to bring people together in these kind of non-local spaces. And at the same time, we need the local communities where people are gathering and are working with each other on the ground. And then there's this really interesting tension, right? Because we've got these sort of global systems that are and structures that are trying to make sense of global perspectives, global governance, and they're not succeeding very much. I'm thinking of the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals, and this feeling of, well, yep, we're failing. We're not
Mm.
anywhere near achieving these goals. And then other efforts like the Inner Development Goals,
Yeah.
a more recent
Yes.
initiative that's come about,
Absolutely.
which is trying to inculcate this notion of, oh, we need inner development in order to bring about the sustainable development goals. And there are struggles there too. There is an idea for a kind of framework, if you will, of various capacities and skills that, yes, maybe if we cultivate them, that could have a ripple effect in terms of our pro-social and pro-ecological behavior, and may shift the needle when it comes to the sustainable development goals. But there's already backlash there too. There are lots of people who are kind of signing up for it, and I've been involved. I've put my ear to the ground. I've been an academic advisor there. But also, I'm very aware of other voices that are saying, "Oh no, this is a global framework, and it's neo-colonialism, and it's imposing something again from the West to the rest of the world." Um, so there are tensions there about this whole thing with global, local. Where is it coming from? Who says that this is a framework that everybody should adopt? Yeah, that's such interesting tensions to feel into and see. How do we find a good way
Well,
forward?
yes, absolutely. And I think this comes back to what you were saying about questioning sort of the identitarian approach to things, which is very much, and you know, about rejecting, and this is along with post-modernity actually, rejecting grand narratives, rejecting sort of attempts to find global standards, because they're associated historically with colonialism. But at the same time, this is something I've wrestled with myself, because I think, well, I happen to believe that human beings do actually have a number of things in common. We all want to not suffer. We all want to be happy. We all want to live good lives. But how can you do that in a way that's not just reproducing those toxic sort of control hierarchies of the past, where it's basically all white men at the top, you know,
Yeah, yeah,
um, taking everything from everyone else, from
completely.
someone, I should say.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that recently there were exchanges around that in regard to the inner development goals on social media, and people questioning the notion of a goal, that is problematic. Why? Because that sort of predefines something, right? And inner development can mean lots of different things to different people, and maybe it's more a matter of asking the question. So an inner development quest, and this can mean many different things to people around the world. So rather than narrowing us down and saying, here's a sort of rigid framework where we all need to comply to certain standards, I don't think that the Inner Development Goals team actually mean to imply that. But by choice of words and by the way it's framed, put into boxes in a particular framework, it sort of signals that between the lines. Um, so shifting away from that and more opening up, inviting people to explore what is it for me to develop myself. And whoa, actually, maybe that's more a question that comes up in the global north. Maybe in the global south, it becomes how do we develop, right? More of the Ubuntu orientation. I am because we are. We are. I am you. You are me. Not that sense of individualism that is so dominant in the global north. So honoring that inner development can mean very different things for different people. And we already have the indigenous and the spiritual wisdom in many different places around the world. And giving that greater visibility, saying, oh, look, this is how people are doing it in other countries around the world. And we don't have to impose some kind of framework. We need to listen to each other and hear those stories and be inspired by those stories. I think that's part of the solution. I tell you what, one other organization that comes to mind there is the Conscious Food Systems Alliance. And they are really building community around the world. And there I've seen some beautiful examples of exactly that, of showcasing stories of, in this case, farmers and food growers who are working with the land in very organic and more spiritual ways, feeling at one with the land and growing food in relationship with the land. And it's beautiful to see those examples, and we can learn so much from each other around the world. That feels like the solution to me. Storytelling, learning from each other, hearing from each other. What does inner development mean to you? And then take it from there. Yeah.
I think again, there's a lot to unpack here. We could probably carry on talking about this for hours. I mean, a couple of points. I think personally, I'm an epistemological pluralist, which is a fancy way of saying that I think there are many ways of knowing, and there are also probably there are actually many ways of being. And I think a lot of this is about honouring that plurality. It's maybe also about finding your own particular place within that and community within that. But I think that's a good tonic to sort of in this sort of universalism, which is perhaps imposed from above. But it's also that I think what we need to be thinking about is what comes beyond progress. If we can't really believe in progress anymore, how do we move beyond that? And personally, I'm inspired by books like Greiber and Wengrove's The Dawn of Everything, which is all about, the deep past of humanity, which I find an endless source of inspiration. And it turns out that people in the last 10,000 years, 100,000 years have lived in many, many different ways. And I think that's another reason why you mentioned left and right being a problematic political labels. And I think that it's incredibly problematic, because if you widen your scope to 1,000 years, 10,000 years, or even you just widen your cultural scope, you realize that there are many different ways of life. It's like a sort of, I was going to say messy bush or a tree.
Yeah.
It's beautifully complex. And I think one of the tragedies of the modern world is that so much of that complexity has been reduced to sort of monoculture, really.
Yes.
So for me, and this is true of spirituality as well, actually, that I think maybe we need to be thinking in terms of, rewilding
Yeah.
and re-enchanting. I think that was a word you used in one of your lectures. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that I love that idea that perhaps what we can do to counter many of the destructive effects and things happening is to start rethinking afresh how we can really sort of regrow and
Yeah.
rebuild and recover,
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you. And that sense of where are we, if I make it really personal for myself, where am I noticing that I am being narrowed down in my options? Whether it's in the, watching certain media, social media, you can feel this sort of narrowing down coming in, you know, n- this is how it is, and this is the solution, or you're wrong, this sort of really strong narrowing down of consciousness. And then feeling into, oh wow, where, in what places and spaces, in which stories, in which communities is this happening? This opening up, this permission to see more of the complexity that is life on earth. It's so beautiful. There's such vast variety of life. And yes, modern culture somehow is collapsing things down into very simplistic narratives, into this kind of black and white thing, which is just not true. There is no left and right. People are really diverse. Um, and cultures are diverse. So this sense that there is some kind of monolithic culture, or simple politics of one side versus another, it kind of belittles the real sort of truth of and the real potential of humanity, I think, in relation to all that is. So let's open the apertures of awareness and perception and action. That, I think, will be my kind of overarching message, right, to everyone. Let's open up and let's feel into the questions and live the questions together rather than narrow down and think we've got answers, which we clearly haven't. We may have some answers, but let's open up rather than close down. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, I mean, we're coming to the end of the interview. So, have you got anything you're working on at the moment that you'd like people to know about or engage
Mm.
with, maybe?
Yeah, for sure. We're just about to actually launch the next season of Nurturing the Fields of Change, which is our online community for people working on change projects around the world. So it's a good time to hop on board. It's a year-long program that opens every February. In fact, actually, we've just made it we're monthly membership program, so you can join anytime. But in essence, it's a community where you are tapping into a network of like-minded people with fresh perspectives from around the world, who are sharing their stories, and we're sitting together in circle and we're sitting with those bigger questions. So that's a really good thing to jump into. And then I'm also running a year-long laboratory which is about embodied imagination, which is my kind of original play space. I love working with the performing arts as a way of kind of bringing about this inner liberation. So that is also online. So again, people can hop on board with that. We can maybe make the links available, and then people can
Yes.
just click through. Yeah, yeah, it would be lovely to see. Yeah, some of you listening here to join those. Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. So, yes, we'll put the links in the notes. So, any final thoughts, but perhaps any hopes for the sort of year ahead, or?
Yeah, there's a lot of craziness in the world. I hope we can stay with that. I hope we can all find others around us who help us to feel what is going on and to live that together so that we are not falling out, not burning out, not dropping out, but coming together in community to gradually bring about the kinds of changes that our hearts long for. So, wherever you are in the world, I hope you have others around you who support you and lift you up. And yeah, let's do that for each other so that the light in the world increases. Yeah, thank you.
Mm. So, yes, absolutely. I think the time is now to think about this community and rebuilding and rewilding, sort of the exterior and the interior. Well, thank you very much, Jessica. That's been an absolutely fascinating talk, and I do hope you'll visit us again.
Thank you very much, Matt, for this opportunity.
What Lies Beyond with your host, Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. This podcast accompanies the What Lies Beyond book by Matt Coburn, now available for purchase on Amazon and other retail outlets. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com.